So it's my honor and privilege to introduce my friend Iyad El-Baghdadi, who will be joining us from Oslo. He's the co-founder of the Kawaakibi Foundation, and I first got to know him 2011 during the Arab Spring, when he became one of the most important sources on Twitter, first for creating open source maps on the current situation in Libya, almost on a day-to-day basis. Then he developed a whole new reputation for a series of tweets that became known as the Arab Tyrant Manual, which were scathingly funny and yet deadly serious critiques of the common techniques and tropes used by leaders in the Arab world to suppress dissent, free assembly, and democracy. We've kept in touch over the years, and then one day, about 5 years ago, he disappeared. And it turns out that he was picked up by police in the UAE one night, middle of the night, I believe. He can correct me on that. Thrown into jail, stripped of his passport, and put on a plane to Malaysia, where he was forced to live stateless at an airport. Thankfully, he was given refugee status in Norway, and eventually his wife and son were able to join them. And he's been working hard there ever since. The last time I saw him was almost exactly a year ago at the Oslo Freedom Forum. I actually wasn't attending the forum. I was in town for something else, but I promised I'd swing by to say hello. And while we were there, he said he wanted to introduce me to a friend of his named Jamel. Older gentleman, looked familiar, wasn't sure why. We chatted for a bit, realized we both lived in Washington, D.C., and he said, well, let's get together for coffee sometime. That was Jamal al-Khashoggi. And as most of you probably know, several months after that, he was murdered at the Saudi embassy, Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Iyad, who worked very closely with Jamal, has been working ever since to try to understand what happened and how it happened. And because of those investigations, as reported by The Guardian not too long ago, he's been forced to go into hiding in Norway with protection from the Norwegian government because of a threat that was intercepted by a foreign government, suggesting that the Saudis were about to go after him next. The work we do is important. It can be extremely powerful and ideally influential, and Iyad's work has been all of that. But at the same time, work can come at a cost. And Iyad, I think, personifies the bravery and honestly the heroism that's sometimes required to tell the truth and to tell the truth loudly, even when telling the truth puts you gravely under threat. So with that, it's an absolute honor and pleasure to welcome my friend, live via Skype from Oslo, Iyad El-Baghdadi. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Andy.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. You know, when you introduce me like that, I start to wonder, what am I doing with my life?
You're doing good work, sir. That's what you're doing.
So, the topic that I really want to talk about is how, the importance of open source investigations when it comes to covering authoritarian regimes. The introduction that just came before Andy, the gentleman was speaking about how open source investigations serve a certain purpose, because you're saying, don't trust me. These are my sources. You can take a look at them and you can confirm on your own. I think when we're covering authoritarian regimes, dictatorships, there is another purpose. The purpose really is that these regimes are very highly opaque. You cannot cover these regimes the same way that you cover a democracy. I mean, if you're actually covering Saudi Arabia, if you're a reporter or a journalist and you're covering Saudi Arabia the same way that you're covering the United States, then you're going to get played very bad. It's not just the fact that they're actually opaque. They don't, they don't exactly share a lot of information. There isn't a lot of transparency in their societies in general. It's also that they can lie, and it's also that they have unlimited resources, which means that they can actually change things around. They can run loops around you very easily. I remember, for example, a conversation that I had with a reporter I greatly respect. This was in December, I believe. This was 2 months after the Khashoggi murder, and we were talking about what happened to Saud al-Qahtani, Saudi Arabia's Prince of Darkness, the right-hand man of Mohammed bin Salman. Maybe not very much known to a lot of people is the fact that Saud al-Qahtani is not only the person who was in charge of the Khashoggi murder, he was the person who was directing the team. But also Saud al-Qahtani is also the head propagandist. He's the troll master of the Saudi regime. So he has a certain footprint, a certain kind of fingerprint on the propaganda that comes out from Saudi channels. This is one way in which we kind of notice whether he is actually working at the top of his team or whether he's taking a break. I mean, there is a noticeable difference. At some point after the Khashoggi murder, there was a week or maybe 10 days in which we did notice that Saud al-Qahtani was not around. But then after that, he came back, and he came back strong. And we could see that from the effect of his work, really, from the output of the propaganda, not only quantitatively, but also qualitatively. And at that time, I mean, journalists who would want to actually confirm this, of course, there were news that, Saud al-Qahtani has been sacked. He might be put on trial. He might actually be, face the death penalty because he's going to be held responsible. He's going to be the fall guy for the Khashoggi murder. And our own sources, anonymous sources, of course, this is another problem, of course, when you're covering authoritarian regimes, is that a lot of your sources are themselves anonymous and they're taking great risks to speak to you in the first place. So, like, if I'm speaking to a reporter and saying, this is what's happening, I can't even share my source. And this, of course, becomes a problem. I have several sources, for example, who I speak to them using fake names because they are greatly at risk. So there was the situation where we knew something happened, but then reporters, if we want to actually meet the bar of authentication that is required for something to be printed in a major newspaper, we're not going to meet it. You're not going to find, people are asking me, like, can you actually prove any of this? Can you actually prove with direct evidence? Did he move? Did he get a new office? Did he travel? And I'm like, if that's the bar that you're going to look at, if this is the system of authentication that you're going to follow, they're going to run loops around. There's going to be months before you can confirm anything. And by the time you confirm that, they've already changed matters, they've already covered up, they've already done what they needed to do in order to get away with it or to get on with their next target. So this is something that, of course, Jamal, being a journalist, understood very well. Jamal Khashoggi understood very well. A bit of context here. The Saudi propaganda engine, there are certain things that governments, authoritarian regimes generally, can hide. So they can, for example, if you're looking at satellite imagery, for example, that's open source intelligence. But then they can hide they can actually hide certain things in bunkers. They can move the pieces of weapons around. So there's something that they can actually stop doing, at least do differently. There is actually one thing that they cannot stop doing, which is propaganda. They're always going to be producing. So imagine the situation where, just for you to kind of understand that one project that Jamal and I were working on, before his murder. Imagine the situation where you are in 1960s, let's say, And you can see a map of the, and on that map, you can see in real time all the propaganda that's being produced by the by the Soviet Union. Not only what the propaganda is, but where it is produced, for who it is produced, what in response to what events in the world, and how it's being disseminated, how they're segmenting their audience, and how they're actually constructing narratives in opposition to other narratives in the world. In other words, how are they handling news in the world? How are they spinning that for their audience, and how are they segmenting their audience, internal audience, so that they're sending some message to certain people and others to another people. Of course, it doesn't take much to see that have tremendous intelligence value. Not only because we're going to be able to see what is important to them, but also because we'll be able to access at a certain level, especially if we look at a prolonged period of time. We're going to be able to understand how they think. This is very important when you're actually covering dictatorships, because there's such a dearth of actual information and direct evidence. Sometimes we have to rely upon what we know about them. A lot of these guys are known quantities. We know what their what the goals are. We know what their tactics are, and I think there's also the fact that highly centralized regimes and absolutist regimes such as Saudi Arabia today, sometimes we project our own rationality on the actors involved. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we might think, oh, this is too stupid for them to do. We might be thinking this is irrational for them to do. This is not useful for them to do. That might be true, but also it doesn't mean that they wouldn't do it. Mainly because you are not speaking about, so like if you're speaking, for example, about a democracy, generally it doesn't even have to be democracy. Even if we're talking about some authoritarian regime that has some degree of institutionalization, there is a certain system of checks and balances. There's a certain the institutions basically are built in such that should kind of guarantee some kind of rationality. This is not the case when you have an absolutist regime. It's not possible for you to actually think, oh, this is not rational. There is rationale in the end. Sometimes they would be doing things which are, which are rational. More difficult
his connection isn't great.
Behavior. It's actually more difficult to actually figure out, what is the range of possibility when it comes to their actions. This is actually something that was staring us in the face when we were wondering what happened to Jamal. Because we were thinking, even Jamal himself was thinking the worst case scenario is going to be rendition. The worst case scenario that his mind or our mind is that they're going to kidnap him. And then they're going to force him to do a statement in Saudi Arabia saying that he willingly went back to Saudi Arabia. And of
he's going through an encrypted line. I'm not sure what else to do.
With the reality, really, that actually went a lot further than that. So, I mean, you cannot actually say this is too much. Again, you're not talking about a rational, institutional kind of system of governance. So anyway, going back to the propaganda and trying to propaganda or reverse engineer their propaganda. In 2011, the Arab Spring started, a lot of their propaganda was based on newspapers, TV stations, radio, basically traditional media, conventional media. With 2011 and the rise of social media as a tool of expression and a tool of really dissent in the Arab world, they quickly realized they realized that they have to actually have their own propaganda engine on social media. In Saudi Arabia in particular, the most popular social media was Twitter, more than Facebook. Twitter in 2012, I believe, even published some figure. I think between July and August of 2012, there was a 3,000% increase in Twitter accounts from Saudi Arabia. And of course, we speculated that this was not only Saudi citizens going, of course, a lot of it was Saudi citizens, but also it was a lot of government accounts being created. The Saudi Twitter So what happened essentially is that the Arab public sphere on Twitter, Twitter became the Arab public sphere. The Arab public sphere went from being an offline phenomenon to an online phenomenon, almost by accident, really, because the offline phenomenon, the offline space, the real world space was closed. This is why this is why I ended on Twitter, for example, because we lived in a kind of situation where that was the space available to us. The Saudi space is particularly dynamic because of the high penetration of Twitter in the country, but also the high degree of engagement, I guess, by Saudi users. And even after, when I was arrested in 2014, it was really because I used Twitter to express myself and to communicate with the world and to push out ideas. So in 2014, there was this assault on Twitter users in Arab countries, but the Saudis spared, and that continued until 2016, 2017 with the rise of Mohammed bin Salman and Saud al-Qahtani. And really, when al-Khashoggi chose exile in August of 2017, it was because the hammer was just about to fall. And in September 2017, it did. Of influencers, Saudi influencers on social media who are very influential when it comes to forming opinion. These are thought leaders and opinion makers in Saudi Arabia. They were arrested. We actually tabulated all sides in the everyone who was arrested. If you actually tabulate all their following, so all of their Twitter following, you get something like 50.
Iyad, I'm just going to jump in for a second here. Could you speak a little slower because the connection is getting a little choppy, and so if you speak a little slower, we can make sure we're capturing everything you're saying.
Sure. So we tabulated the total number of followers of all those people who were arrested in September 2017 and since. So there were waves of arrests. In September, a lot of social media influencers were arrested. In November, it was the Ritz-Carlton incident. In March, there was a gag order against certain feminists. Of course, the feminists were not allowed to speak all the way from September of 2017. There were arrests in March of 2018, and then there were arrests of the women's rights activists in May of 2018. Along with this phenomenon, so on the one hand, they're actually taking down legitimate voices, but at the same time, they were boosting their own fake influencers. So they were basically they were constructing this propaganda engine in real time. Of course, this created a situation where they have total control over Arabic language Twitter. They can shut down communications. They can shut down. They can disrupt discussions. They can mob dissidents. They can deliver threats. They continue to do that even today, unfortunately. But this allowed us to actually watch the watchers, so to speak, because we can see they took their propaganda engine and they put it online. Online means that we can actually see it in real time. We can actually see by looking at their own Twitter output, we can know what hashtags they're pushing, why they're pushing them, how they're segmenting their audience, how they're pushing different messages in response to real world events, and we can also understand what's important to them and what's not. So this was an idea G brought to me. This was a conversation that we had of 2018. He gave me a call. He said, why don't we do this? Why don't we create an Arab media monitor that would kind of expose the internal narratives, the narratives used, the propaganda used by Arab regimes? And of course, we talked about doing the Arab newspapers, which are, of course, completely state-dominated. We talked about their stations. Of course, we talked about their primary propaganda tool right now, which is social media. Unfortunately, Jamal was killed before we could get this rolling. In fact, I believe, so he spoke to two different activists as far as I know. I'm one of two that he spoke to about this. And the last email exchange was, I think, a week before his murder. And of course, we decided at the time, we cannot drop this. This is important. This is something that he wanted, but it's also so as very important. It's an important tool to supplement other tools when it comes to covering dictatorships. So we got to work. We started to actually get on with it and try to start to construct a certain methodology and certain tools, certain software allow us to watch what they're doing and what they're saying. And it was really in of 2019 that we thought, okay, this is something that really calls for this methodology to understand a very, very specific incident, and that was the whole situation around Jeff Bezos' relationship with Mohammed bin Salman.
Could you say that part again about Jeff Bezos?
Jeff Bezos' relationship with Mohammed bin Salman.
The photos.
So, at the time, I mean, to explain why why Jeff Bezos is part of this conversation in the first place, Jeff Bezos, at the time of the Khashoggi murder, must have been in quite a bind, because he is a man who had, at the time, a personal relationship with Mohammed bin Salman. He had a direct relationship with Mohammed bin Salman. He had met him several times. He had very extensive business interests in Saudi Arabia. He had projects in Saudi Arabia that were as yet not declared, enormous projects. And I believe they were only a few weeks away from being declared, as in fact, the Davos in the desert was supposed to be a moment when Jeff Bezos would show up in Riyadh and declare that, these are these amazing projects that we're doing with Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, Jeff Bezos happened to be the owner of the Washington Post and ultimately Jamal Khashoggi's boss. This is a question that we ask ourselves many times. We don't have any proof, but it is quite possible that the Saudis only were emboldened to go after Jamal Khashoggi because they thought that they had a measure of control over Jeff Bezos.
And so ultimately, when you had to go into hiding, it was because of the investigative work you were doing with Bezos' team to try to connect the dots between Jamal's murder, the Washington Post coverage of the murder, and the fact that suddenly a very embarrassing story came out about Bezos, which, by all signs, according to your research, as I understand it, was pushed along by the Saudis.
Yeah, so the Saudi involvement here is that in November, they started they started associating Bezos with Washington Post in a very public way. So they started saying that, Washington Post and Amazon.com, they're kind of the same thing because they're owned by the same person. So since we don't like the Washington Post has had this campaign for justice for Jamal, let's hit back at it. So they tried to catch Bezos' attention in November. And when that didn't work, they shifted to punishment. But yes, I mean, when I sat down with Norwegian intelligence, of course, one thing I could do is that you would actually do a risk assessment and say, okay, why is this happening? And we ended up with a list of, 8, 9 different things that might be directly, a lot of these things are basically just about. But the top of the list was the Bezos investigation because it was the most public and potentially the most damaging for Mohammed.
So, on the one hand, you as an individual writer, it didn't take much for them for you to get grabbed from your home and ultimately ending up in Norway. And now, of course, the threats you're currently experiencing. While at the same time, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the world and one of the most powerful news publishers in the world essentially gets targeted as part of the same operation. We're running out of time here, so I guess what I would ask, how in the world do we First, secure ourselves, steel ourselves to combat disinformation from regimes that can fight in such a sophisticated fashion. And secondly, how do we keep up our spirits? How do we do this without falling into despair and knowing that we will never have the same resources that they do?
Yeah. So the first question, really, I think we need to speak to the companies that actually operate these platforms. So I'm talking about Twitter, talking about Facebook, etc. I mean, they have a role to play here. Their platforms are basically used as propaganda engines by certain regimes, but they're also used as active engines by dissidents. And this is something which is important for these platforms to acknowledge. And I can tell you that Twitter has been quite cooperative whenever we thought to reach out. But of course, there's a lot that still to be done. The fact is that Twitter continues to be the prime propaganda weapon of not only the Saudi regime, but many regimes. And this is something that I think needs to as for the question of resources, I'm kind of comforted by the fact that you can have all the resources of the world, does not make you smart.
But not what? Say that again?
You can have all the resources in the world that still does not make you smart. People who have lots of power think that they're geniuses, and a lot of the time they're not. In fact, sometimes simply because they have some resources, they're actually more arrogant, they're more prone to make mistakes, and there's no one there to actually correct them and to say, you made a mistake.
So it's essentially a matter of us finding all the mistakes, exploiting them, shaming them, and then continuing to do the good work as best we can.
I think we have to expose them. I mean, people have a right to know. And a lot of these, one thing that they do is that they complicate the story. Sometimes the story itself is complicated. Saudi Arabia, the Middle East is complicated anyway. And sometimes they overcomplicate the story to the point that people simply tune out. And I think this is where it's important for journalists to take this down to the level of, this is why it's important for you and me. This is why it's important for the Jamal's murder, for example, was one of those things that were very evocative and very emotional. And you know, there are many people, there are many Jamal Khashoggis. Jamal Khashoggi is not the only journalist who was murdered. It's just that it gives me some comfort to know that my friend's murder did not, that it led to this kind of awakening.
That hasn't led to what? Say that part again?
I said Jamal's murder and what happened after that, I think it gives me some comfort to know that his murder really produced this kind of awakening. It was not a forgotten murder, in other words. It did produce an awakening as to the threats faced by dissidents, by journalists who are trying to cover a regime such as Saudi Arabia.
Iyad, it's been an honor and pleasure talking to you today. Stay safe, my friend.
Thank you.
Take care. Now, I'm sure all of you noticed that the connection we had there was not optimal. Given his circumstances, though, it's also not a surprise. One of the questions I would have loved to have talked to him about was, so what security measures are you taking? How are you able to talk to me in the first place, given the situation you're in? And he's like, yeah, you've got to be kidding me. We're not talking about that. And that's the tough part of it, because on the one hand, as researchers and journalists and others who work in this space, we all need to have a stronger sense of our own safety, our own operational security, and the various measures we can take to protect ourselves, whether it's through encrypted communications, anonymous use of the web through Tor and browsers like that. And it's an important conversation to have, but the irony is that the people who are under the greatest threat and are doing everything they can to just keep moving forward, they ultimately are the best case studies in understanding how to do this. And yet, we can't ask directly. So